welcome to our 6th of 7 academic advising seminars. Today we're going to be having a guest speaker, Mikhail Snicker-Magan, and he'll be talking about communicating with your advisees. Our final session for advising seminars, the date has changed. Instead of April 12th, we'll be meeting March 29th in this room, same time frame, 11 to 12:30. Our guest speakers will be talking about how to use Blackboard 9.1 for your advising seminar. Thank you all for your attendance here, and I'll turn it over to Mikhail.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. And thank you for your time this morning. Hopefully everyone who wanted food was able to get food. It looks pretty tasty, I would say. And thanks again for your time and interest in this seminar. We're a small but a good group this morning, and we're going to talk about communicating with your student. So before we jump into that, I'd like to talk a little bit about myself and just explain a little bit about my background and how I got interested in communicating with students as it relates to FERPA, which we're going to talk a lot about today, and then some ethical issues with regard to email and the use of computers in communicating with students. So a little bit about myself. I'm a certified rehabilitation counselor, a licensed professional counselor in 2 states, and I work in the Educational Counseling and Disabilities Office. Most of my background is in working with people who have a disability, although I also worked in corrections for a while and youth residential treatment. So I have kind of an interesting background, and I find that work with students who have a disability to be very interesting and compelling, and I have to admit that I get excited about FERPA, which not many people get excited about. So I'm going to try to share that enthusiasm with you today. I made an agenda for today's meeting, and I like agendas because they almost never work. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to use the time that we have the best that we can. And what I'd like to do is give you enough information so that we could look at a couple of scenarios. So not just giving you the information about communicating with your student and FERPA, but also what are you going to do with it? Sort of like the so what. Now that I know this, what am I going to do with it? And so we have a couple of scenarios that I'll ask probably just everyone to work in one group and then come up with some discussion points that we can review. At around 12:15, Lise Gramza is going to be with us, and she's going to talk about identity verification, directory information, and then non-disclosure. Those are her areas of expertise. And then right before that, this is sort of the teaser, working with angry and emotional students. We're going to try to cover that in about 15 minutes, which is an interesting idea, but we'll do the best that we can. And that sort of ties in with the scenarios as well. So I think the starting point would be looking at some of the basics about communication and what some of the outcomes are for today. So some of our outcomes are looking at confidentiality issues related to advisees in your respective role in your colleges. And then an issue of much discussion is electronic communications. Last semester I taught an FSUS course and found that it was also an advising role that I took on as well. And it was a very interesting process for me to work in the classroom and then also to work with students out of the classroom in terms of the communications that they would offer. Emails that were very brief, they read like a text message, and were hard to decode sometimes. And then how do you respond effectively to emotional and angry students? So we need to lay the groundwork for our discussion by talking about FERPA, which is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, also known as FERPA. It's enforced by an office called the Family Policy Compliance Office that most people haven't heard of. That's within the Department of Education. And FERPA governs how we use personally identifiable information that students share with us. And when Elise comes in a little bit later, we're going to talk about what kinds of information are covered under that. And then we have a campus compliance officer. Kristen Salmonson is our campus compliance officer. So what I'm focusing on today is how do you communicate with your advisee, and how does that relate to FERPA? And then if you're bound by ethical guidelines or licensure requirements, how do you make all of that work in your communications with your student? So as part of that process and getting to that communication piece, we need to define who is an eligible student. And that's kind of an interesting point of discussion, as I've seen on some of the listservs that I belong to. And then who does FERPA apply to, or what institutions, I should say, does FERPA apply to? Who has a legitimate educational interest, and then what records are covered under FERPA? So an eligible student is someone who turns 18 years of age or enters a post-secondary institution at any age. So I've bolded enters because that's an important point. You can have applied to, say, Ferris as an institution, but not attend, and if you don't attend, you're not covered by FERPA at that point. Question?
What about a dual enrolled student?
Yes, good question. That is one of the issues that I want to talk about today. It's a very interesting situation, but basically if they are dual enrolled, if they're a Ferris student, then they're a Ferris student covered under FERPA, even if they're under the age of 18 years. I like this question. Does FERPA apply to Ferris? Yes, because we receive federal funding. But then we have this issue of what's a legitimate educational interest. So, for example, if I have some information about a student that I need to share with someone in criminal justice, one of the faculty in criminal justice, how would I determine if that faculty member has a legitimate educational interest? And that's sometimes an issue of discussion and sometimes some issue of frustration as well when people are trying to clarify, well, what is that? What is that interest? So, but from the law, it's defined as other officials, teachers, they use the term teachers here. I also point out contractors as well. So if there's a relationship with Ferris, then there's a connection. Consultants, volunteers, and other parties with whom the school has outsourced institutional services and functions. So in essence, anyone who is working with the institution in some sort of a capacity. And then the question is, well, what kinds of records can be released, and what's an educational record? Now, this is probably one of the most interesting and difficult issues to address. But educational records are records that are directly related to a student, with some exceptions that I'll point out, or by an educational agency or institution acting for the agency or institution. So contractors, maybe someone who contracts with the institution as an attorney, and maybe those records would be considered as part of an educational record. Now, there are some exceptions, for example, and one of those exceptions would be law enforcement unit records. So someone working within the Department of Public Safety, for example, the records that they keep on a student are not considered educational records. Employment records for students who are employed by the institution are not considered educational records. Medical records, this is the issue I deal with often, is when, say I'm working with someone who is working with the Burkham Health Center, and we're trying to clarify maybe a disabilities issue. Their records over there would be medical records because they're used primarily for treatment. But then sometimes what we face in the office that I work in is we face the fact that we have documents that are treatment records, but they're now covered by FERPA, not HIPAA. So what do we do with those records? It creates some interesting ethical issues. And then alumni records are also not considered educational records. So I've created a couple of scenarios from real life experiences. And this first one I've called Amber, and she's a student you've worked with for the past year, and she's recently changed her behavior. So this is someone that you have a working relationship with. She used to be really reliable. She would show up on time. She was enthusiastic about her education. She'd email you often, and then this past week she appeared about 20 minutes late. She was disheveled, and she didn't seem very connected. She was having a hard time articulating thoughts. So as an advisor, you have some concern about the student. Your role is not to assess or diagnose the person, but to try to get them some help if that seems appropriate. So maybe what we can do is just, since everyone's pretty comfortable, it looks like in their seats, I can just take a sampling from folks and we can talk about what you might do. So you're not sure what's wrong with her, and when you mention that you've noticed some of the changes in her behavior recently, she starts to cry and says, "My boyfriend and I broke up last night. I don't know what to do. And to cap things off, it's a sunny payday Friday here at Ferris at 4 p.m. And you have to be in Grand Rapids by 6 to catch a flight. Who do you call, and then how much do you share? How much do you share in terms of information? Because you might have a pretty good background on this student, having worked with her for the past year. So how much information do you share, and who can you share that with? Does anyone have any thoughts about what they could share and who they might call?
My first call would be over at student counseling.
Okay.
And I would try to see if there was someone available who could see her now if she chose to go there. Because I know I can't force her there.
Okay.
So I would strongly recommend direct her in that direction to just, at least if nothing more, sit down and talk to somebody that's never met her before and just work things through for a little bit.
Yeah, okay. So what kinds of things might you share about what you know about Amber, when you're on the phone with someone over in the counseling center?
That you notice a change in a pattern, or a personality or a pattern, but you can't obviously say anything about grade. I think you can talk about that because that's obvious to everyone who will be around her or contact her.
And do you think someone at the personal counseling center would have a legitimate educational interest in what you're sharing? I would say yes, they probably do, because we're talking about a mutual student. And so, I would say, depending on how much information you need to share to help the student and convey the concern that you have, you could convey a whole bunch of information. I have found myself in that situation a number of times, and my situation is a little more complicated due to licensure law, but being able to share information can be really helpful for the student so that they can get maybe the treatment that they need. And I think sometimes the question is, well, what exactly do we share? I mean, if we know that the student has said, well, I broke up with my boyfriend last night, do we share that with the personal counseling center, or do we, sort of let them work through that? What do you think?
I personally wouldn't give them any details.
Wouldn't give any details.
No, I would just tell them that like we said, there's a change in their behavior. I don't want to get too detailed because I don't even know who I'm talking to over the phone.
And I'm not qualified. I'm not a qualified psychologist or licensed professional in that area. Let them let them take it.
Okay.
It's behavior that I'm concerned about.
Yeah.
And I'm going to try to convince her to come see you.
Yeah.
Question. If you twisted the scenario just slightly and another student came to you with concerns about her friend Amber, then what?
And what do you do with that information? Well, it's an interesting question. It's secondhand information, hard to know if it's true or not. But I would say, on the one hand, if you don't know the information is true or valid, that might be of some concern. But on the other hand, it could be very accurate that there is some concern about that student. And so I would say a couple of things. I would say information could be shared if it were necessary. If the situation were so emergent that action needed to be taken, so if the situation were turned a little bit and the student was described as despondent, perhaps suicidal, and had the means to take her own life, and there was some really significant concern, you could take some immediate steps, and we'll talk about that a little bit. To share information, it's really that connecting the dots. And I think when we look back at situations that have occurred prior, so we think about the Virginia Tech situation and Northern Illinois, and we think about how can we best communicate about student information, the balance is making sure that we provide enough information to help the student along in their process of going through the referral and getting connected with the appropriate services, and then hoping that that information isn't used in a way that would not help the student. So, with the issue of a student maybe being despondent, how much information do you share? I would say, maybe you share a lot of information about, I'm really concerned about this student. I don't know all of what's going on. And Lee, I think your point is well taken as well. It's not necessarily your role to figure out what's going on with the student, but sharing the information so that someone else can make that determination, I think is a good approach. So that's a very good question. And I think sometimes it's difficult because we like to think that there's a clear-cut answer for everything, and there's not. And sometimes the process is a little bit messy. But when I think about disclosing information about students and using information about students, the questions that I critically pose are questions like, how is this information going to help the student? So if I can release information to the counseling center, if that's where the student is going, that will help the student along, then maybe that is something worthwhile. But how about, let's take this scenario, Mike, and I really appreciate your question. Let's take this scenario and talk about, say, and I've had this happen, a student who discloses to a faculty member in the classroom that he has schizophrenia. And the faculty member, it was at a different institution, the faculty member did not have a good response. It was a difficult response. And at that point, the faculty member was understandably very frustrated with the student. So the student has made a disclosure about his own life, what's going on with him, and then the faculty member wasn't clear, well, what can I disclose to a counselor, for example? And so sometimes that kind of a situation, in that circumstance, the student was not stable and there was a significant concern about his behavior. And so at that point, information can be shared more readily because we need to not only help the student, but also make sure that people are going to be safe. And so this is the second scenario that I posed to you about Todd. A student who'd been working with fairly consistently misses an appointment. As a courtesy to the student, you email him, and this is a situation I've taken from my actual practice. You send him an email and ask him to arrange for a new appointment. The next day, you receive a phone call from the student's mother demanding to know if her son has been appearing for his appointments with you and for a progress update. How is my son doing? How are his grades? And what has he been talking with you about in the meetings? And so this can play out in advisement as well, where you have a parent calling and saying, I need to know everything that's going on with my son or daughter. She then says, so to sort of make a wrinkle into this, so let's say it's a student for you who you're advising who does not have a disability, but then the mother says, well, my son does have a disability, by the way, and I know my rights under the law, and you need to tell me what's going on with him so that we can help him due to his disability. And to top things off, she pays lots of good money to Ferris, and as a result of that, she has the right to know everything that's going on with him. How do you respond? Lee?
What's the signed release of information from the student? Is that his waiver of his FERPA right?
Yes, sorry. Good question. So you do have a signed release from the student. You know, so the student signed a release form so that you could talk with his mother and father. So you do have that on hand. It's a valid release. You believe it to be real. And so you do say that to the parent. Well, I do have a signed release, but do I have to provide you attendance information or progress updates?
Well, if that is part of education. If you're talking to them about as part of your class, I believe you do.
Okay.
Because she had, with that release, he's waived his right for you to disclose it to the parent.
Yes. So
and I mean, I had a very similar situation, not a disabled student, but a student who actually got an email from the mother because the student wasn't doing very well after the first term and asked me about his grades, and I replied I couldn't do anything because I didn't have it. The student stopped in and said, you can talk to my mother about my grades. I went and found out he had 1 A, 5 Fs. The A he got was in concert band, and the other ones were in classes he should have been in, and it was all about attendance. Well, she then told me that's not her son because he's a good student and he would attend class. And it was funny, she said the same line, I pay a lot of good money to Ferris. She said that exact same line to me. She said, why don't you guys have tutoring for him? And I said, because he's got to come and ask for the tutoring, you know.
Yes.
I'm not in his class, I wasn't one of his professors, I was only his advisor. And I had no knowledge of this until I see the grades. But
yes.
It's very similar to, in that vein into that what you have there.
It really sort of moves you in the direction of, you know, are you an advisor or a case manager when parents are asking for that kind of information and support? Like, why are you not taking him to the tutoring center or the academic support center by the scruff of his neck? Why are you not doing that? And we know the answer to that, but, you know, when faced with maybe an angry parent or someone who's frustrated and doesn't understand the differences between, say, high school confidentiality issues and then post-secondary education confidentiality issues, that there is a significant difference. When we go back to the definition of who is an eligible student and at what point does that eligibility take place, well, it's when they enroll in classes here, even if they're under the age of 18. And so parents who think that, well, I had a right to those records in high school and think that that applies in post-secondary ed are often mistaken. And then sometimes become a little bit frustrated and irritable and challenging to work with. So there's a couple of different layers here that I just want to point out to you in this scenario with Todd. One of the layers is that there's nothing in the disability law, just to clarify, there's nothing in disability law that talks anything about confidentiality. Confidentiality relates to FERPA. When we're talking about confidentiality, we're talking about FERPA, in some cases for a counselor licensure law or ethical guidelines. So because sometimes I hear that argument, I know my rights under the law as it relates to my son with a disability. And it has nothing to do with ADA and 504. So that's one issue, but the other issue that you touched on, Lee.
Is that 504, is that under ADA?
It's a little bit different. ADA, and I like talking about ADA and 504, which is sort of my area of expertise. But 504 is a different offshoot in terms of providing services for students who might have a condition, but they don't need specialized services in high school. So it's kind of like an IEP light, so that students can still get some of those services. And so 504 is often cited. I know my rights under the ADA or 504 as a reference point, which is always interesting because I know what those rights are as well. I like to talk about them. So the other issue that I think you touched on, Lee, which I really appreciate, is the fact that there is no mandate to disclose information. I had a parent call me 2 weeks ago and say, I want to know this very similar situation. I want to know what's going on with my son. And it was this very situation. I sent the email to the student as a follow-up. Coincidentally, the mother called the next day. And I had noticed a pattern of behavior. This had happened now 3 times. 3 missed appointments, and then 3 subsequent calls. Well, it seemed a little bit more than coincidental in terms of what was going on. So when the parent says, you have to release information to me, there you've got the release of information in your hand as an advisor. And you're looking at it and you're like, well, there's the release. Do you have to disclose information, or is it something that you can disclose if you choose to, but are not mandated to? You want to take a guess at that?
I think it's my choice.
Absolutely. It's absolutely your choice. So when you hear that argument, you have to release that to me. As I talked with the parent, I said, no, I do not have to release attendance information to you, or whatever the issue is that the parent is wanting to get information about. Because in some cases, if the parent is asking for, has my son showed up for the appointments with you, I could at least venture a guess that that information is going to be used against the student, even if I have a signed release of information. So you're absolutely right. It is that voluntary disclosure. It's not a mandate to disclose, and oftentimes people misunderstand that. They say, you've got a signed release, you have to release information to me. So in that circumstance, I differed with the parent who was not terribly excited about my response. But that is an area that you can stand your ground when you have someone as an advisor and you're concerned about the student, but you're also concerned about how is this information going to be used? Is this going to be detrimental for the student? And in some cases, that's a possibility. Anyone else had that statement from parents? I pay good money to Ferris, and I have the right to know what's going on.
I haven't heard that, but I've heard several demands that they're your typical helicopter parent that I got to know everything about my son, and my basic response is that we're not going to talk.
Yeah.
Because I didn't have release forms, and I didn't have any contact with the student prior to the parent calling. So the phone call really was real short. Parents were not happy.
What is it with the parents, with the student themselves, him or herself will say that, we're paying them good money and kind of take it as it's just the customer mentality that they,
Yes.
As opposed to, an education.
Yes, that customer mentality of, well, you've got the signed release and I pay good money, so why shouldn't you give me the information? But I think the takeaway point is that, you really have you're empowered, duly empowered by the institution, right? You have a legitimate educational interest if you're working with the student as an advisee. And you can, if someone else has a legitimate educational interest in that information, share it with another school official or with a parent if you have a signed release, but you don't have to. So it's really up to you. You get to decide. Now, a few things I should say about FERPA. So since we started a little bit late, I'm going to move along to a few other slides. So information that's used electronically, for example, in My Degree Notes. Has anyone used that? Lee?
For my freshmen and sophomores.
Okay. I would ask, did you like it, and then how useful was it in terms of a communication tool with students?
Well, I use it primarily when I'm meeting with them and advising, because I'll know when they met with me, what date and time, and that, you know, we made the following changes to the plan, or they're following along the plan.
Yeah.
Basically, it's my audit trail. So when they come in and pass it, it's used to and say, well, you know, I'm not graduating because you told me this, and I'll pull out the paper copies and say, here's what I told you, and here's what you took. Now, it's not my problem that you didn't follow along with what we talked about. And I said, well, I couldn't get in that. And I said, then come see me. That's what and he says, well, I thought you were too busy. Well, I guess you're going to be not too busy because you'll be an extra term going to school, I guess, because that, you know, but that's what I use it for, is that gotcha more than anything else.
Yeah, so it's a good reference point when you're working with students. For this slide here, I kind of like this slide. I had to call my wife and make her use her student record consistent with FERPA.
Did you get that in writing?
I did actually get it in writing the same night after dinner. In blood. So you can kind of see her name up there, but she was a willing participant. And here, actually, it's kind of an interesting mistake that I made. I made an entry into My Degree in the notes section. As far as I understand, this information is viewable directly by the student. So this could be a communication tool. Anyone seen that? That students can access the information? I say that because it's a little bit different than banner information in the comments section. So the mistake that I made was I made this entry and I found out that I didn't have the authority to delete the entry and was calling around campus to get the entry deleted because she already has her graduate degree and she already knows what she's doing, unlike what I do here, and that she doesn't need to go to educational counseling abilities. So information from My Degree, do you think that's information that can be released under a subpoena? If you're subpoenaed? Probably.
Anything. You can get almost anything under subpoena or court order.
That's true.
That's those guys over there.
So there's My Degree, and then there's, I'm guessing everyone's used banner comments fields to enter information about students, and I think prior to My Degree, there was the use of banner comments fields for exactly what you're talking about, Lee, with making notes about student progress towards a degree or exceptions as a communication tool. Also available most likely under subpoena, but not viewable by the student. So I would just make that distinction for you so that when you're looking at My Degree and you're putting a note in, that is a communication tool with a student that they can readily access, but that's not true for self-serve banner comments. So as we break down the modes of communication under FERPA and we talk about different ways to convey information, I wanted to point out a few different issues. One of which we've touched on a little bit, which is through email. The person who is emailing you may be an imposter. In other words, how do you really know it's the person who they say that they are? And that coupled with it's harder to identify and verify the person. Like, how are you going to check their ID? Through email. You lose the context of email through email in terms of communication. Is the student upset or frustrated? It may come out differently. Content is easily misunderstood. And then I think the biggest issue that I've seen is there's no immediate response to clarify. So it just sort of lingers out there in terms of a timeline. And it can be days, hours, or weeks, and sometimes students expect an immediate response. Like, why didn't you email me back within the past hour? And then this one, which is kind of interesting in a new area of concern, which is if a student emails you and says that I'm thinking about hurting myself, and they're taking a distance learning class and they're in Alaska, how do you respond to that? And how much information can you share? So then we have the in-person and phone contacts, which are a little bit easier to work with in terms of identifying the person. You may have worked with them long enough to recognize their voice. I had a situation last year where a student called our office. I talked with the student for a few moments exactly about releasing information from his educational record, and I stated what he needed to do in terms of filling out a release. And a few moments later, someone else called the office claiming to be the same student, and as I talked with that person on the phone, it was quite clear that there was a different tone of voice and a different voice. It sounded like a different person. And they were asking for the entire educational record at that moment. You have to send it right now. So how do you reconcile that when you believe it to be, an imposter? And then in person and over the phone, you get a better context of, if this person is frustrated, you can hear that in their tone of voice. And then you have the immediacy, which I really like. You have a way to respond to them right away. Wow, you're really frustrated. Can we get you connected to the personal counseling center this afternoon? And then I have to go to Grand Rapids to catch my flight. So now we're going to move on to the topic that I really like, which is emotional and angry students. Has anyone played Angry Birds? Or had students mention Angry Birds? Okay, Lee, yeah.
Sure.
Anyone else?
Know about it.
Know about it?
Though.
I know about it through students who have talked about it, and some students have found it to be a really interesting game, so much so that they're not studying, which is a whole different issue. But I like the slide and the image because it's kind of cute. So how do we deal with, so we're sort of shifting gears now, but it kind of relates to FERPA as well in communication. If we take the scenario, say, with one of the two students, Amber or Todd, and they come to see you, but they're pretty agitated. What are some starting points for... So you've got Amber here. She's crying in your office, but she's also quite agitated. And it's not within your realm to say, well, I know she's got a condition or a problem, exactly what that problem is, but you can see that she's, physically agitated. She's making fists often. She's quite tense. You can see that her breathing has changed. Some of those, very basic kinds of nonverbal communications out of line. What are some things that you can do to perhaps help someone like Amber who's in your office on that sunny payday Friday? What's the starting point, would anyone think? The stunned silence, I love it.
When you're communicating to her, you have to have more of a soothing talk. You cannot get excited or raise your voice, which is very hard for me, by the way. I'm an angry person, everyone tells me. I just look at me.
That's what you've been told.
That's what I've been told. So, but you have to convey some sense, one, of sincerity. Because if you're just saying, this happens, don't worry about it, and you're just trying to blow it off, that will only, and my belief, exasperate or accelerate the issue and make it even larger because you don't understand me. Focus should be on the student. You should try not to escalate the situation. And a lot of that is with the tone. That's my opinion.
So maybe try a soothing voice. Just recognize what the problem is.
Get Jason today to talk.
Okay. Get Jason to talk with her.
Because of the voice.
Because of his voice, yes.
He's got that radio voice.
Well, hopefully Jason is watching this and he'll be cued in, that he'll be called upon frequently. So the soothing voice, not adding additional stress and pressure to the situation, but also realizing it's not your responsibility to fix all of the student's problems. Sometimes I have to remind myself of that. When a student comes in, they purposely have an appointment with me and they bring in 6 different problems that they be resolved in that appointment. And for 20 minutes of the appointment, they're crying. And is it reasonable or realistic to think that all of those issues are going to get addressed in one meeting? Absolutely not. But can you get the student connected to other services and also get them calmed down enough so that they can get connected with other services? I think sometimes it's hard for students when they get agitated to fully process what they're being told. So sometimes what I do is I slow down my speech pattern a little bit, and I try to distill what's the most basic terms. And dumped you, you dumped him, that relationship has not worked out. You know, this is outside of my realm, but I know people who can get you the help that you need to deal with this. But you have to be willing to seek the treatment. You have to be willing to do that. And so I think that's a good point that you've made. You know, we're not going to drag people over to the counseling center or to Burkham or anywhere else for services. We generally don't do that.
So when people are normally, when they're agitated or you think they're agitated, in the past it's worked well for me to allow them to vent and let them talk and let them do most of the talking, because there's no way, like Lee said, you're not going to argue or try to contradict what they're saying, because it's almost like arguing with your dog. It's not going to work. So what you do is you just let them go and they vent and they tell you, and then ask very open-ended questions and just let it go.
And just let it go.
Be the bartender.
Exactly right.
Well, and sometimes that's just what they need. If they come in all upset, and then it's just because they don't know where to go, they don't know who to talk to, and you're the first person, you know, the only person or the first person they know, and they're comfortable with you, and so it's just a matter of, you know, being able to kind of let their hair down and be able to talk about it with somebody and feel comfortable doing that. And sometimes it's not a matter of you needing to call, it's just a matter of, you know, having that person to listen to them and kind of go from there. And then as you're doing it, you can assess whether you need that or if it was just they needed someone to talk with.
I agree. And you might be, as the advisor, the only point of contact for that student in relationship to the program or in relationship to the institution. So you might be that point of contact that the student has and that they feel like they can trust you. And maybe it is that they just need to vent and they don't know who else to turn to. And part of what they're learning if they're a traditional student is how to develop resources in their life that can help them. And maybe part of your role in that process is helping them get to the resources that they need. So not trying to be everyone's resource for everything, but getting them connected with the resources and then how much information can I share about what I've seen. Now, an interesting corollary to this is that information that you gather that's in plain sight. So if you've worked with a student, the student's been in your class, and then you're also the advisor for that student, and you have noticed sort of a decline in their appearance over the past few weeks. Their hair is kind of greasy, their face is broken out perhaps, they look a little more depressed perhaps, or they're struggling, they're moving a little bit slower, they're wearing dirty clothes. All of those things that you might observe about someone are not necessarily covered by FERPA. I mean, that's viewable to anyone who can see that student. So that's kind of an interesting issue that came up. Like, what if I see something that's in plain sight? Can I use that information to potentially help the student? And the answer has been yes.
I was going to say that very thing just before you did, that if I'm an instructor in the classroom and I see a change in the behavior or dress or whatever of the student, I'm going to ask that student to stay after class for just a couple minutes and have a personal talk with them.
I think that's a great way to connect with students. You know, you might be the best point of contact for that student and that they feel comfortable with you. And it sends the message that you are trying to help the student, that you see that there's a little bit of concern. It's not your role to figure out necessarily all of the concern or solve it, but that you're reaching out to the student. And I think that's consistent with what we talked about this morning in terms of trying to help the student. But I would say this as well, that even if you did get information and it was observable in plain sight, and if it weren't covered by FERPA, I would say, you know, well, you could release it under FERPA because it's information if you needed to share that. Say you talk with a student after class and you realize that they need some significant help, you could, again, share that information if you needed to, you know, refer them to somewhere else in the effort to help the student. So great example. You know, something that struck me this past year has been some of the roles that I've taken on between, say, the classroom and then individually working with students as an advisor, and how those roles shift and how students might see me differently in those different roles. And so what I found interesting was that some of the students who I worked with in the classroom presented so very differently when I worked with them individually. For example, a student in the classroom was like barely keeping awake for the whole class meeting, a short class meeting as well. But then individually they were sharing with me lots of information about how things are going. And I think it sort of illustrated to me again how for students in this FSUS class that I was their first point of contact at Ferris. And for many students, they were willing to come back and talk with me about what was going on. Some of it related to advising and some of it didn't. Some of it suggested that they needed to be referred to someone else. And so I say that because I don't want to minimize in any way the role that you have as a professional or faculty advisor, that your role is really crucial in terms of working with students, and that you feel reasonably empowered to share information to help students, even when there's not a clear-cut answer about what's going to be in the best interest of the student. So let's just look at the Todd situation. And so remember with Todd, you've been working with him fairly consistently. He misses an appointment. And this is actually a scenario that I dealt with this student. And then the next day you receive a phone call from mom. The student comes back to talk to you after that whole set of events. Mom calls. You say you don't have to release the information. And then the student comes back to you and is upset. And you ask him, what's going on? And he says, well, my mom's been really getting on my case about going to class and going to meetings and stuff. And then for the first time that you've seen in working with this student, he starts to cry. I mean, you know about him that he's a student who doesn't like to cry. How do you respond to that student? You are the only person that student is connected to, as far as you can estimate. Because you know that there's an issue with, maybe he's having some difficulty with his mom. You're not going to get in the middle of that issue. That's not your role. And you want to be supportive. And yet, maybe, the parents have some good information about their son or daughter. But you need some trust with that student. What do you think you might do if you were faced with that student starts crying and then appears a little bit angry as well because he sees that maybe there's a trust issue now? Would you suggest to the student that maybe he revoke the release of information? Sometimes that's done, if there's a significant issue with a parent. Lee, you look a little contemplative back there.
Well, I do. If you make that suggestion to the student, then does that open up another can of worms with the parent, saying, "Why are you advising? What right do you have to advise my son to waive his right that he has given his biological parent? Who made you superpower to do that?"
Yes, and I pay good money to Ferris.
Exactly, and he's disabled.
He's disabled.
504 point.
And I know my rights under the law, and I've got a good attorney.
And I don't believe the release information would come from the student anyway. It'd be a pressure from the parent to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in that situation then, and I've actually had this happen where the parent has then called the student, revoked the release of information. The parent calls and is very angry and says, how is it you could give that kind of advice? The answer is, well, the student is considered as an adult on a college or university campus, and as such, he can make a decision about who to include in terms of his educational planning. So I understand you're angry, but it doesn't change the fact that without a release of information, I can't share information with you. The exceptions being the student is so despondent or troubled, and you need to share some information with a parent to help the student in relationship to a public safety issue, for example. But barring those exceptions.
Of course, as a parent, I don't have one, but soon. And it will be either he signs the waiver, or he can figure out how he's going to pay for his education. I'll hold the parent carrot of he who has the gold makes the rules. That's the golden rule.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there is that.
There has to be a trust between them. Obviously, as it said, there doesn't seem to be a trust in Todd and his parents, or his parents don't trust Todd, maybe because of his story or whatever.
Yeah.
There has to be some trust in there.
There has to be some trust in there, and you don't want to get in the middle of that. Hello, come on in. So definitely good points. We've talked a little bit about emotional and angry students, and I would remind you that, and I'm not a behaviorist, I should say that. I come from the Carl Rogers school of thought about working with people in an existential way. And then a little bit in a cognitive way, challenging some irrational thinking is kind of my background. So I'm not a behaviorist, but I do remind myself all the time that all behavior is communication, even if we don't understand it. And I've worked with people who had significant cognitive impairments. And they would do things like smear feces on the wall in a residential treatment program, or injure themselves repeatedly. And so the question is, what are they communicating? There's something, obviously we have not figured out what it is, but there's something going on with that person that is resulting in that kind of communication. So someone withdrawing from you, so the Todd and Amber situation, the student who suddenly withdraws from their work with you as an advisor, like Amber being, she was really positive, she worked with you all, sent emails all the time, thanked you for your help as an advisor. When all of a sudden she stops sending emails, even though you're certainly not providing case management services, you might wonder, I wonder what's going on with her, if there's something going on with her, because it's atypical for her. And so all behavior is communication, and I would also say that it's important to make a distinction between someone being angry, because it's possible to be angry and not be unsafe. You can be angry, like I can be very angry and not a safety risk to anyone, just angry. That's okay. That's definitely possible. And it's also possible to be calm and unsafe. So that would be someone who, has a firearm and they're quite calm with it, and they're talking about doing something that's harmful to someone else, but they're calm about it. And so how much information can you communicate about the person? I would say all the options are on the table when you're looking at something like that that's so significant. That is the connecting of the dots. And here at Ferris, we have a mechanism in place to help students and faculty and staff, as we'll see in the definition, through what's called the behavioral review team and then the threat assessment team. And I apologize that on your handouts, there's supposed to be this nifty chart that I will get to that didn't quite come through on the copier. On yours, it just has the dots, but no arrow. So this is really connecting the dots here for you. So at the lowest level of intervention and support is, what can we do in the classroom? What can I do individually with the student as I'm advising them? So in the scenario situation, giving the student some feedback, getting them referred to appropriate services. But if that doesn't seem to address the problem, then do you ramp it up to the behavioral review team? And the answer could be yes. And then the threat assessment team is for very significant events or concerns. I recently had a situation where I referred someone to the behavioral review team in the interest of connecting information, and I was really struggling there with how much information can I release and still assist the student, but also make sure that the interests of the institution are maintained. So the behavioral review team is a really good resource and is available for consultation when there is concern about potentially harmful, threatening, or disruptive behavior of an individual. Faculty and staff or others may refer any student demonstrating behaviors of concern to the Dean of Student Life and then the Director of the Counseling Center. So I would say the behavioral review team is a good resource for you to get some additional input, and it helps take you out of that situation where it seems like everything is just reliant on you to make a decision. So you get some additional expertise and resources brought to bear on the concern or the issue with the interest of helping the student.
Can you tell me who sits on the behavioral review?
I can.
That's like, well, thank you.
So this is somewhat, it's a little bit dated now, but you can see I wanted to share this slide with you so you get a sense of all the different layers of professionals that sit on the team that have some interest in what's going on with a student of concern.
Actually, I think it's up to date.
Is it up to date?
Paul Blake is now represented for
Okay, good. So it's up to date. Thank you. And then so faculty as well as administrators and the personal counseling center housing, so residence life, and then also human resources as well. So you really bring in a lot of resources to address the concern or the issue. And I would say be safe rather than sorry. If you have a gut feeling about something is not right with a student and it's significant enough that it can't be addressed directly with the student, or they're not willing to get a referral somewhere else, then you have some options at your disposal, and you can share lots of information under FERPA. You're duly empowered to do that.
And we react quite quickly. Sometimes that afternoon, somebody calls a meeting, we meet, depending on what the issue is, we meet quickly.
Yes, so it's not a slow process to get some wheels in motion if you have a student that you're really concerned about. And I would say even in my circumstance where I've got some ethical guidelines that I need to follow as well as licensure requirements in terms of disclosing information, when there's an issue that rises to the level of something like the behavioral review team, then all of the options are on the table in terms of sharing information that will be used to help the student get the support that they need, but also to make sure that everyone's going to be safe and balancing those interests. And so the good news there is that you don't have to make all of those judgment calls. Maybe getting the person connected to the resources that they need. So good question about who's on the team. This one I find kind of interesting, and I wanted to share with you, and I borrowed an image from Google Images where it seems like all the best images come from for presentations. And sometimes I've heard this argument that, you know, I have a disability, and as a result of that, I can't control my fire setting behavior. And fairly consistently, the legal system has responded with exceptions to disability. So I can't say that I have pyromania, set a building on fire, and then just claim as a defense that it's my disability. It might be true that it's a result of pyromania, but you don't get protection for that. And so if there's a situation where you have someone who's got a fire-setting behavior, you can definitely communicate information. But I also point out that pedophilia and kleptomania are also on the list. And carefully worded the illegal use of drugs, so someone who's illegally using prescription medication or alcohol abuse. And so those issues are not considered disabilities. Sometimes people will say, well, you know, I've got an alcohol problem and it's a disability, and therefore you have to help me, and current alcohol abuse is not considered a disability. It's a problem, to be sure. I had a student tell me somewhat recently that they had gotten out of jail and that they had a disability, but I would say getting out of jail isn't a disability. It's a problem, to be sure, that you were in jail, but not disabling. So, and as we're sort of winding down here with our discussion about emotional students, that FERPA empowers school officials to act decisively and quickly when the need arises and is an important part of emergency preparedness. So it really sort of unshackles you in terms of what you can share about a student. And I think if there is no other takeaway message from today, there is that notion that you can share lots of information if you feel like it's necessary to help the student and to help the institution as well in balancing those interests. Because I think the alternative is maybe you don't share enough information, and then, you know, if something happens, you know, I would say you'd rather be safe than sorry. And then let some of the other experts with their expertise, say from the behavioral review team, bring those resources to bear on the issue to look at next steps. So, you know, it's more obvious when you have an angry student who's menacing, so someone who's, you know, there with their fists clenched and saying they're going to kill you. Sharing that kind of information with other folks is definitely possible, and you can take immediate action. And I've had that happen before. I was working with a student who dissociated from himself and lost touch with reality, and then became physically aggressive in the classroom. Doesn't happen too often, but every once in a while it. So it's really not that kind of a situation where it's really obvious, like what do you do with that? Kind of you call public safety, share information that you need to, but it's more often the gray area situations where it's the Todd or the Amber. How much information do you share? It's most often that's what you're going to encounter as an advisor. So we have a few deliverables, as they're called, homework assignments outside of this discussion today. And I've said 3 deliverables in 3 weeks. I've tried to keep it simple in 3s because I know that the semester is winding down and that folks are quite busy with end of semester activities. So what I'm asking that you do outside of our meeting today is to send me a brief email with the response to these 3 questions, and then I will turn it over to Elise. So I just want to talk about the scenarios briefly. The first one is Tony, an advisee, is angry and in your office. He indicates that the Disability Services Office won't help him with his accommodations for his schizophrenia, and as a result, he is now failing. I always love that one. Those darn people in disabilities are not helping me, and as a result, I'm failing. And as he looks around your office, and I had this situation come up in a somewhat similar way recently, he mentions that there are bugs crawling on his skin. You plainly observe no bugs on his skin. Can you call our office, ECDS, and what kinds of information would you share as an advisor? Would you call the Personal Counseling Center, and what kinds of information would you share with them under FERPA? So 3 deliverables in 3 weeks. So 3 basic scenarios. How much information can you share regarding Tony? You have some concern about him. You don't really know what's going on. And I think Elise is going to talk about this a little bit, describe some of the pitfalls of using student personal email accounts. I've had this come up, I can't tell you how many times. Students who refuse to use their Ferris account and will only use their personal email account. And that's sort of the issue related to imposters. You know, like how do you know who the person is and how do you verify that? And that's one of the topics that Elise is going to talk about, verifying the student identity. So if you could just identify some of the areas that you might have some difficulty with regard to some of the problems with regard to using personal email accounts with students. There's some good and some bad there. And then probably most interesting to me is, can you give me an example of a FERPA problem you've had in the past before this training and how you might approach that same problem differently now with some of the information that you have regarding how much information you can share under FERPA. So I've given you a few examples, but I'd really like you to pull an example from your own professional experience as an advisor about what you might do with that situation with your new information at hand. So just those 3, within about 3 weeks or so. I said April 5th, but it's not a hard and fast deadline. And then I will forward on those deliverables to the appropriate folks as part of completing this seminar. So some specific response, if you could email that to me, and my email, I believe, is on the last slide, snitkem at Ferris, snitkem at ferris.edu. And with that said, this is Elise's cue, and she has some really good information and expertise. Elise Graham is our registrar and one of our resident FERPA experts who is also excited about FERPA and communication. So thank you.
I'm Elise Gramza. I am the registrar here at Ferris, and the registrar's office is typically known as the FERPA police. And hopefully all of you know and love FERPA just as much as Mikhail and I do. But if not, I'd like to go over a few things with you. Some general information, nothing really too in-depth about the books that I have in my office on FERPA and all of the exceptions, but basically the general rules to abide by. First of all, just that FERPA stands for the Family Educational Rights Privacy Act of 1974. And I kind of categorize it in 2 ways, or 2 kind of categories of what FERPA does for students. One, it gives students the right to inspect their educational records and request to have them corrected if they find any inaccuracies. And that's more of a concern of our office, something that we would deal with. Something more typically anyone in the university could deal with FERPA would be the part of FERPA that protects their educational record. And it's important to follow these guidelines. First of all, they're federal guidelines. And with faults of FERPA also include fines, lawsuits, and eventually we could in some cases, lose our ability to give students federal financial aid, which is a huge resource for our students to be able to even attend here at Ferris. So there are big implications for protecting that information for our students. And Mikhail touched on this before, just a few minutes ago, is that legitimate educational interest. And that's an important piece even as an employee here at Ferris. Just being an employee here at Ferris doesn't give you the right to access any student's educational record. You have to have legitimate educational interest. And actually I can read what that's defined as, since Mikhail pointed it out in the previous slide. Legitimate educational interest is defined as you have to be able to access that record to perform an administrative task outlined in a person's official job duties, perform a supervisory or instructional task directly related to the student's education, or perform a service or benefit for the student, such as healthcare, job placement, financial aid, etc. So as an employee here at Ferris, that gives you, those three things give you a right to access specific students' information. If you don't have one of those three things, if you're just curious about your neighbor's daughter that goes here and want to see how she's doing in classes, you wouldn't have a legitimate educational right, even though you have the access, for example, in your MyFSU, your self-service banner, to access that information. You shouldn't be unless you fall with one of those three categories with the students. FERPA also concerns not only us within the university, but external third parties. We cannot release any of that protected educational information to any third party without prior written consent from the student. Now, there are some exceptions to that rule. For example, in our office, we get subpoenas for information. And again, those are typically things handled by the registrar's office or general counsel, are those exceptions to FERPA. What you need to be concerned about is that prior written consent that is not the exception. That is kind of the rule or the standard for FERPA. So there's kind of two things, and that's actually this slide, and Mikhail said you have a copy of it, that kind of define what you can, yes?
It'd be nice if it was printed out so we could read it.
I think,
I
think Mikhail said you,
there's a copy in your packet.
Can't
Is
read
it not
it.
can't read it. It's on Ferris's website as well.
It's in the packet.
And
You
there's
got
a
it?
link on this
Okay,
as
where's
well.
this one?
That's the one.
Yes, that's bigger. Yeah, that's a little easier to read, isn't it?
FERPA reference sheet.
Yes.
Okay.
And if for some reason you lose that document, if you go to your the login page for the MyFSU before you log in, there's also a link to that document on that page as well on the Ferris website, so you can resource it when you're sitting on a computer as well, if you don't have your paper copy. So this is an important document because it defines what's considered that educational record that is protected. So we kind of split the record into two categories: directory level information and non-directory level information. Directory level information is what we consider available to any third party if they were able to request it. Things like their name, their phone number, their address, their admit status, those general pieces of information, anyone could call you and you could provide that information on a student. Then there's non-directory level information, and that is what's considered protected under FERPA. So when a third party contacts you and asks for the student's GPA, you wouldn't be able to do that without prior written consent from the student. That is not an exhaustive list. It's pretty exhaustive, but basically if it's not on the directory level side of it, it's considered protected, even if it's not on that list. But that list of non-directory level information is pretty all-inclusive. So that's what we can kind of consider the two different levels. Directory level, not considered protected by FERPA. Non-directory level, considered protected. And something that I like to point out to most people is email addresses. Most people would probably consider an email address pretty similar to a phone number and a home address of a student. But educational institutions have the choice to kind of pick and choose what they wanted to be considered non-directory level information. And we have filed under FERPA that we consider a student's email address considered non-directory, so it is protected by FERPA. So even something that seems so minor, like a phone number or home address, you cannot give out to a third party. Yes?
If a student puts you on as a reference for a resume, do you then have to have in writing the release of information or release so you can talk to their prospective employer who's calling you and saying, I want to talk to you about this student? Or because they put you on as a reference, does that waive that right?
It depends on what they're going to be asking in that reference. I have some specific, we can chat more one-on-one. I have some specific things about letters of recommendations and references, but if you were giving general information about your experience with the student, I wouldn't consider that part of their educational record that's protected. But if they were going to be asking about how they do in your class, then yes, you would need prior written consent from the student. And I have more information on that if you want it. Yes?
Elise, I'm wondering, do you ever share that with Career Services, Lee's
Yeah.
question? Because I'm guessing that a lot of faculty probably have that same question, and I think Angie Roman would probably really appreciate having attachments or maybe even adjusting your website as something for faculty to go to. I think it'd be great buy-in.
I think if we had a standard release, waiver release for references, but if you're listing them as a reference on a resume, because that's what I'm going to do now, I'll go back and I'll write one up myself, and any student says, can I use it as a reference? Sure.
Sign this waiver. I don't see the harm in that. Yeah, the documentation that I have says the same thing, that a letter, which would be the same thing as a call for a letter, you know, a recommendation, directory level information, your general experiences with the student are not considered, you know, protected under FERPA, but any specific stuff that is non-directory level, you would need that prior written consent. And I can talk to Career Services about it too, absolutely, that's a good point.
Hey, Lee, what I've been doing is I make the agency that's calling me for the information, I make them get that from their potential client. And then have them provide me with the release signed to them, clearing me to give them everything they need. And that's the general process throughout. I just had one this morning. People calling me conducted a background investigation on one of our students because they want to hire him. And they want reference, they want class information, they want it all.
But my companies don't do background checks like that. I mean, construction companies won't do like a correctionals or,
right,
you know, law enforcement would.
What are they typically asking?
They want to know how they did in class.
How they did in class. I would get that.
And how their attendance was, and you know, and then it gets into that, if it's specific about a student, is it covered or not, and there's that gray area, and so just
And
CYA.
even their, oh absolutely, even their enrollment in that class is considered non-directory level information. So even confirming they were in your class confirms their class schedule at some point, and therefore is non-directory. We even have, if you want it, you can contact me. We have a general form, a one-time release form that we developed for that one time the student needs us to give, for example, a potential employer their GPA. We have a one-time release that we use. So we have that documentation that the student authorized us to give that to whoever we're talking to or writing a letter for example. So if you wanted that, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel, you're more than welcome to contact me, and I can get that to you so you feel confident moving forward.
We have a sample release in the packet that you were given today as well. And if we could just clarify on the directory that's on the slide, there's the directory information and non-directory, so it's broken down into two different blocks.
Yep.
I think this is a really great resource to use when trying to clarify, you know, what is covered and what information is being asked to share.
Even, I mean, I'm immersed in this every day, and I will go to my little flip chart that has this list and kind of re-verify. Because again, some of the things kind of sneak up on you, like an email address. Like if you are emailing your class and you don't CC everyone in the email, you're essentially releasing that student's email address, which is considered protected to other students in the class. So even something as what seems very harmless as that needs to be considered. And yes, we use this list in our office, and we are immersed in it every day, but we still refer to this list as, okay, is residency considered protected by FERPA? Well, yes, it is. So even some of those minor things, it's always good to double check. And if you always have a question, you can, whenever you have a question, you can contact the registrar's office, and we can clarify. Oh, an important part would be when it starts. Now, typically you're working with current students, and we have defined the FERPA protection starting when a student is not only enrolled for a class, but also starts that class. So that class has to have started. So if they have just been admitted to the university and they have not taken any classes here, they are not protected under FERPA. If they have come to orientation and signed up for classes but have not started those classes, they're not protected under FERPA. Once they have started those classes, then they are protected under those guidelines. FERPA is good until the death of that student. After their death, that information can be released without, obviously, written consent. We still take precautions in our office, even those students that aren't protected yet. For example, that admitted student, I still like to go through a few things with them. So one, they just get used to it. I might ask them a few questions to verify their information, or if their parent contacts me, I might say, I really need to be talking to your son or daughter, to get people used to the idea that once you enroll here, mom or dad, you're not going to be able to call, and I'm not going to be able to tell you this general information. And of course, an only admitted student not currently attending classes, if someone calls me and asks me, for their social security number, it's not protected because they're not enrolled, but I'm not going to give that out. So we do take some of these precautions, even for students that aren't technically considered protected under FERPA for Ferris. We still take some of those general precautions for the advantage of our students and start using it as an educational tool for students that be here anyways and will soon need to abide by the FERPA regulations. A couple different things. In person, it's kind of easy. The first time you're meeting with the student, if you check their ID, you realize that's a picture ID, that's the student you're talking to. You can discuss that non-directory level information. Once you get to know the student and you know the face and name, no, you don't have to check their ID every time they come into your office. It's kind of a given that you know who that student is. Over the phone and email are a little muddier. Over the phone, in our office, we verify several points of information with the student to verify their identity. Things such as, first of all, if we're looking them up, we do not ask for their student ID. If we take their student ID from them and say, oh, yep, I see you here, John Smith, well, if it's not John Smith, we just verified that student ID belongs to that student. So we look up in our office, and I always suggest this to other people, we look them up by last name, first name. Now, if it's a John Smith, you might have to get a middle name or a middle initial in there too, but most likely you're not dealing with, there's 300 of the student that you're looking up. Usually there's a handful, and you can figure it out by, their middle initial or something like that. Then we verify things like their home address, their permanent address that's on their record, their phone number, their email address, part of their birthday, maybe just the month and the day, their currently enrolled classes, the classes they're currently enrolled in, verify that information. We verify what high school they attended, when they graduated, prior colleges they attended, things of that nature. Again, probably right around 4 is a good number to go through with the student. Information, some of that information someone else might not know, or might know, but as you go further into more detail, really only the student should know that information. And then we feel confident that we're talking to the student, and we can disclose some of that non-directory level information over the phone. Email, I wouldn't do it. I'd make the student contact you or come in your office face-to-face. Even email within our Lotus Notes, within Ferris, between staff or other faculty, I would still not email protected information. For example, grades should never be emailed because, yes, we believe Lotus Notes is secure and safe, but what that person does with it after you email it to them, whether they forward it to a non-secure email address, you don't know. So it's best not to be emailing any of that non-directory level information in any fashion, especially back and forth to a student.
Are you in violation of FERPA if that happens? The person you're sending it to, if it's the student, and they forward it by their action, they've waived their right because they're now disclosing it by sending it on.
The thing I would be more concerned about is that we took the initial action to send that information in an email anyways. I mean, we don't know that Lotus Notes can't be hacked. It's not impenetrable. So we took the action to even put that in a source that could potentially be out there. So I don't know. It depends. It depends on how serious it gets.
I understand if it's hacked. That's one thing.
Yeah.
But with you saying they send it on to someone else, any action that a person discloses themselves leaves anyone else of that responsibility. And I will tell you, as a security manager in the military, the President of the United States said something that was classified. It was unclassified immediately. Because he has that right to make it unclassified, period. Mm-hmm. The creator of that information. And so if that student gets that information, sends it to mom and dad, and then complains that mom and dad got it because I sent it to them, to the student, but the student turned around and sent it. They have nothing to stand on in court.
I think it's a less of a concern in that case if the student, okay, so I guess the only concern would be there is what if the student says that wasn't them that forwarded it to their parents. Their mom or dad got into their email address, got the information you sent them and forward. So it's best not to do it because why would you want to get yourself in a situation where there is those what ifs? And it's different than you telling the person over the phone or in an in-person conversation, and then they relay it. It's very obvious that they relayed it verbally to somebody else, as opposed to email. You don't know who's forwarding that email to somebody else, unless you have some way of authentication that you know that that student was the actual one that went in that email address and forwarded it on or read it. It's best not to be putting that information in an email. And we do internally, like we'll do. We have to, when there are those John Smiths and someone else on the campus needs to look at that John Smith's record, we do email student IDs even though they're considered protected information. But that's kind of the worst case scenario if it's someone that really, you're going to find 500 students if you look them up by first and last name only. Some of those kind of, I would say, considered more minor pieces of information we will email, but I would never, like grades, for example, or GPA, those types of things that I would consider more serious as far as what's considered non-directory, I wouldn't email. Social security numbers, I would never email. When someone emails me one of those, I get rid of that email.
We don't even know them.
What's that?
Faculty protected or not, we don't even know them.
You don't even know them? Well, sometimes I have students that full knowledge will email me that, and can you look me up by this? Or they'll try to give it to me over the phone, and I don't want that. I don't want your social, I don't want to hear it, I don't want to see it, your social security number. And I am running out of time, so I will go faster. Good questions, though. Verifying the student's identity is obviously important. If a parent calls and they do not have a release on file, you can't speak to them. And they will probably say, I am paying for my student's education. They are 17 years old. I have every right. No, they don't. If they have any questions or concerns, they can call our office and I can read them their rights under FERPA or the rights that they don't have under FERPA. And you can just explain to them that I don't care if they're 17 and I don't care if you're paying the bills. Once they start here at Ferris taking classes, their educational records are protected, at least that non-directory. Students can choose to release that information. There is a release form that they can sign. They can go to the Timmy Center for Student Services or one of our off-sites and sign it in person with their ID that they release, whether it's a parent, an aunt, a grandma, their spouse. They can choose to release that information. You can find that information in the comments section. Most parents know if their student signed that release, so they'll call and they'll say, I'm John's mom, and I know I have the right to, get this information or at least discuss this information. So you could look in the comments section. Probably you most likely use self-service banner, I would assume, and it should say authorization to release. It could be financial information, it could be academic, it could be both. So you have to check what type of information that student authorized the parent to release. And then it will list the people that have that release. So it could be, John's mom, Judy. And then you'd still have to verify some pieces of information with her. You still have to go through, okay, what permanent address does John have on file? What permanent phone number? What high school did John graduate from? What classes are the same information you would verify with the student, you should be verifying with the parent. And if they can't verify the information, don't give it to them. Whether you think they have they have the release out there, but you can't verify that that's who it is, don't give them the information. If they have a problem with it, again, send them to my office. Even if they have that release, it doesn't give them the absolute right to it. I mean, if you just don't feel right about it for some reason, whether you can't really verify that's the person or it's the kind of information that they're asking for, and you really feel like you need to be talking to the student themselves. One, I always suggest that to parents. Okay, I really need to be talking to John about this. Can we have the discussion with John on the phone? Or two, I would say, you weren't able to verify those pieces of information with me. I would really like to talk to your student. So if for some reason you feel uncomfortable that that's not the person that's named on the release, you still don't have to release the information to them, but you can. The other thing that's important, and very few students have this, but students can also fill out what's considered a non-disclosure form. And essentially that's saying that they don't want any information about themselves released to anybody, directory or non-directory level. There's probably only currently like 10 students who have this. As soon as you look them up, a flag will come up that says this student's information is confidential. What that means is that student has decided they don't want even their existence at Ferris State University disclosed to anybody. So if that student calls you on the phone, you look them up, and that flag comes up. I actually have a document I can give out too. You have to say something along the lines of, I'm sorry, we're unable to provide any information regarding the individual you named. The person in question will have to come to our office with picture ID for assistance. So you can't even say, yeah, John, I know you signed that confidentiality thing, but I can't give you the information you're asking for. You have to deny that they are even a student. You cannot even confirm they're in the system. By confirming that, you're confirming their name, which is considered directory level information, which they signed a form saying, I don't want anyone to know even my name. We stress that to students when they sign that form. This is going to be a huge inconvenience for you. You are going to have to go in person every time you want to do anything at Ferris. And usually they have good reason for signing it. You know, there's been bad roommate conflicts, maybe kind of a nasty divorce going on or something, or they've been stalked. So there's usually very good reasons why they've chose identity theft or something. Usually there's very good reasons why they've chosen to sign that form. They understand explicitly that they're going to have to work a little harder to get any even directory level information on themselves. So they understand what they're getting into, but that doesn't mean they're not going to call you and they're going to test you, because we've had students do that. They want to see if there's any, any faults in the system. They want to see if they can get through, and then they'll call our office and start complaining as soon as someone has released any information. So again, there's very few students that have that signed. Again, the flag is the first thing that comes up when you look that student up. And you have to kind of give that verbiage that you can't even acknowledge that they're in the system or exist. So that's another important thing. And I have that wording if anyone wants it. What's that? No, and I just brought it. And I actually have this in my flip folder so I can just read it off when they call me. I'm like, oh, I'm sorry. Makes it a little easier, so then you know you're not slipping up and using any of the wrong words. So yes, I have that for you. Another thing to just keep in mind, again, be careful what you're emailing. If you're leaving stuff out on your desk, I would cover it up. I'd put it away. If it has any of that non-directory level information on it, if you're getting rid of a document like that has any of that information on it, shred it. Don't just put it in the garbage, because again, you want to make sure you're protecting anything that could get in the hands, like that email that you might send, could get in the hands of anybody else potentially, even if it wasn't known by you, or that wasn't your intention was to give that information. But yes, we're held accountable for information that's even stolen, like security breaches, unfortunately. And that's really it. If anyone has any questions, are more than welcome to contact me. I know I went over. I was trying to go really fast.
Thank you.
Yeah. And when in doubt, just say no and have them contact our office.